All right. Hello. Good morning. It's good to be here. Good to be back in a way. As Tom mentioned, not only was I a member, I had the privilege of serving here many years, also many names ago, which is a different time, but I'm really glad and excited to be back here. I want to also give a special shout out to whoever used a photo of me when I was under 30. I don't know who that was, but genuinely, thank you. I felt better about myself. I know you guys stand for scripture, so if you could please rise. Today's scripture will be coming from Matthew 7, verses 24 to 27. I know you guys read out of the CSB. So this will be out of the CSB. I believe it's in the back of your pamphlets. To give some context, this is the end of the Sermon on the Mount, which I believe to be the greatest sermon given all time. And this is how Jesus concludes that greatest sermon of all time. Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and acts on them will be like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain fell, the rivers rose, and the winds blew and pounded that house. Yet it didn't collapse because its foundation was on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and doesn't act on them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. The rain fell, the rivers rose, the winds blew, and pounded that house, and it collapsed. It collapsed with a great crash. Let me open this up in a word of prayer. Father, I'm so privileged to be here, to be spiritually home in a way, and to be able to just bless, hopefully through the Spirit's help, Grace Hill with this passage and just your word. And with this, and even as they're about to kick off a wonderful series on abiding, I hope that this can prime all of us to truly seek your presence, not the secondary and tertiary things that are attached to the church, but ultimately you. So we thank you in Christ, and we pray. You may be seated. This is going to sound subjective, but I think it's objective. Christian music has always been a little rough. It sucks. Okay, this praise team's great. Okay, Mike Wright is like the best electric guitarist I know. Okay, but I'm talking like outside of worship. And even worship, like, Maverick City is cool, but it's the same song over and over again. But outside of, like, Maverick City and Hillsong, Christian music historically and relatively has been rough. Like, I grew up, for me, I had, like, Toby Mac. I don't know if you know who that was. Great. I'm sure he's a great guy, I hope. Horrible music, okay? I love music. I always have. And so for me, as I'm, like, I'm trying to be, and I didn't understand, because we say, we're saved by grace. We have a new life. And yet the music that celebrates it, it's kind of like repetitive and rough. So for me, whenever I find Christian artists that are both passionate, theological, and also gifted, I hold on to them very tightly. There's a band called King's Kaleidoscope. Love them. There was also an artist by the name of Joseph Solomon. If you don't know him, extremely gifted, extremely talented. Like if he chose the normal business music route when he was younger, he probably would have made it huge. He has a YouTube channel. You guys can look at it too. Not just Christian music, but does covers. He's also like a poet with the slant, when they snap. Like he was that type of poet. He's really good. But in like 2021, I'm following him on socials, and I come across a feed and a post where he says, "Hey, I'm no longer Christian. I'm no longer a believer." Some artists, you kind of like see it coming. Like there's a guy named Gungor. You kind of saw that coming. But with Joseph, it was kind of like out of nowhere. And in this past kind of COVID season, you might have experienced this too. A lot of people kind of left the church quietly and just never came back. Yet Joseph was very public about this. And at first, I was like super distressed as a pastor and as a fan of his music. I still listened to him. But one thing, he had a podcast, and if you have a chance, I think it's called Flights and Feelings. Listen to it. It's a great episode where he talks about why he is no longer Christian. And this is a guy that's been born and bred in the Christian ecosystem. He was literally making a living off of the Christian world. This is what he said in the podcast. Whatever you believe, you have to own it. You can't lease it from anybody. You can't rent it. If you borrowed it from someone else, now is a good time to see what truly belongs to you. You can't lease your faith from anybody. You can't rent it. You have to own it. I can end the service here. It's a great quote. And it's the gist of my sermon, okay? This quote sent me in a spiral for many years. And this sermon is kind of a culmination of just this kind of idea sparking a lot of ideas in my own life. Being an Asian American, being a Korean American, born and bred in the church, like my first memory of my life is not my family, it's not my parents, it's not my brother, it's being at church. And reflecting on this quote, and I realized there's so much depth to this. And the question I want to ask you today is this, as we reflect on the passage we just read: do you own your faith, or are you renting it? Are you leasing it? Are you borrowing it? Quick caveats. I've thought about this for a while. This is like a culmination of like 2 years of thoughts. And my church people have told me when I get really passionate, I start spewing out all these crazy ideas. So if I do that, I apologize. But I just hope you can take what sticks, okay? But as Jesus is speaking, one thing I want to make clear before we get into everything is this. Jesus is ending the Sermon on the Mount. And you've heard this story before, this message, where it's kind of the main theory or the main message is, if you build your life on anything other than me, it's not going to last. And one thing I want to make clear is this. This message is, in this Sermon on the Mount, he's directing it to his disciples and followers. So one thing I want to make clear here is this. If you've been raised in the church, born and bred in the church, listen carefully, not to my own words, but this what hopefully Jesus is saying. But if you're new to the faith, if it's kind of, I don't know, someone dragged you here, you're like, why am I here? Like, whoa, okay, I'm here. I hope this can give you an introduction to I think Jesus is truly laying out religion in his life, faith to be. And I think it'll be radically different than what you expect. But first is this: don't lease your faith. A house in the ancient Near East, it wasn't like a house of today. For many of us, when you think about the time spent in your house, it's mainly spent to rest, recuperate, and get back to work. Work from home has changed a couple things, but usually your house now is a place where after you work, you come back. You kind of get a drink, turn on the game, lay down on the sofa. That's what a house is today. But back then, a house was much more than a place of rest. It was a place of your livelihood. A house in the ancient Near East, if you were a fabric maker, if you made clothes, if you were a welder, it would all be done not in the workplace, but in your house. So you would spend the majority of your life in your house. So even from there, what Jesus is saying is this. He's not saying this loose analogy, like, oh, this is a house and faith. No, he's saying your life, your livelihood has to be built on me. And if it's not built on me, if it's built on fame, greed, beauty, whatever it may be, your roots will always show with time. And you've probably heard that message if you've been in the church. But I want to give a wrinkle to that, a 2025 interpretation. I think another way that we can take this that Jesus is saying and even warning us is this: don't lease your faith out. You have to own it. You have to pay the down payment. You got to get a mortgage. You got to put the hard work in. What am I saying? There's another famous passage from Philippians 2, verse 12 to 13. And Apostle Paul writes this, and I believe it will be behind me. Therefore, my dear friends, and listen carefully to how Paul propositions this. Just as you have always obeyed, so now, not only in my presence, but even more in my absence. Keep that in your mind. Work out your own salvation with fear and trembling, for it is God who is working in you both to will and to work according to his good purpose. Now listen carefully to what Paul is saying, because I think it matches up to what Jesus is saying. Back in the day, Apostle Paul did not have a podcast. He did not even have his letters kind of spread out. He was writing this to the church in Philippi. And think about what he's saying. He's saying, I know when I'm physically with you, it's very tempting just to be like, oh, Paul's here. Yeah, I'm a Christian. But he's also saying it's very tempting when I leave physically as your pastor of sorts for you to be like, yeah, I'll wait till he comes back. What is Paul saying? Paul is saying what Joseph Solomon is saying. Don't lease your faith out. You have to own it. You have to work out your salvation. This could be a whole different sermon, but the Greek word for work out means to work towards completion. Meaning this, let me start with a warning of sorts. You cannot lease out your faith to Pastor Tom, to Pastor Sam, to Pastor Shim, to Elder Vince. They cannot be your landlords. That's not their function. You have to own it. And think about the audacity of what Paul is saying too. You know, we live in a very different time. If you want a good sermon, and look, Tom, Sam, Shim, I think they're great preachers. You don't need to come to Grace Hill. Tim Keller's Sermon Archive, the Michael Jordan of preaching, is available to you for free. You can go home right now and listen to a better sermon than I'm giving. But Paul, in this ecosystem, understanding that, and even the letter to Philippi, the Philippian letter, it's not even in their hands yet. And what he's saying is, even with this sparse amount of resources, don't lease out your faith. Don't rent out. You got to work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. What does that mean? Well, let me take a step back. What is renting? Let's just do a basic, one-on-one. What is renting? What is leasing? I rent. I lease. I've resigned to the fact that as I live in the Bay Area, I will never own property in my life, right? Unless it's like the size of this pulpit. It's just not possible. Why do you rent and why do you lease? How does it work? When you rent, think about this. You're always renting from someone for something, okay? You're always renting from someone that owns that property, a landlord, a friend, whatever it may be. And you're renting probably to save money or for some purpose to make your life a little easier. Right? And let's take this example a little bit deeper. When you rent an apartment or lease out a car, the amount of care you give to that object is very different than if you own it. You know what I'm saying? Now, if you don't know what I'm saying, I have a good friend that goes here, won't name who he or she is, but he or she owns their house. And I'm at their house a lot. If you know me, you probably know who this person is. And our family has been there, and their hypothetical family with kids has also been at my house that I rent, okay? And when they come over, kids are kids. They spill stuff, right? And when they spill stuff at an apartment that I rent, I'm like, oh, it's okay. As long as I cover it up and I get my security deposit back, it's all good, right? But when my kids spill stuff at my friend's house, there's an anger that comes out, right? My daughter once, I think last year or 2 years ago, spilled nail polish all over the floor, hypothetically, of this house, right? And, if it was at my house, I'd be, oh, it's all good. Carpet. As long as the landlord doesn't see it, we're good. But this friend who owns the house was like, there was a level of rage that I've never seen in him before, right? I was like, whoa, wait, what is this? He owns the house. And it's righteous anger because he cares for it. And when you lease a car, my friend leased a car once. You know what you do on the last day of the lease? You go buck wild, right? I had a friend who had a car. He was like, hey, he called me up. He's like, hey, guess what? I was like, it's the best day of your life. It's the last day of my Beamer lease. You know what he did? We did donuts in a parking lot forever. He didn't care about the tires. It's not his. He can give it back. When you lease something, the amount of care you give to that object is much less than when you own it. Let me go a little further, too. Why do some people lease or rent things? Often to save money, to make it more comfortable, but also you can lease a different lifestyle and portray a different picture of yourself that you cannot afford. You know what I'm saying? I had another friend that doesn't go here, so don't even think about who it is, okay? But this friend, didn't have a crazy job, and which is fine, but he liked the finer things of life, And I remember one day he had a Corolla, or he or she had a Corolla, and one day he had an Audi A6. I was like, what the? I was like, where'd you get this from? He's like, oh, don't worry, I'm living the good life. And I was like, okay, cool. Drove around. 2 years pass, and on the date, that Audi disappears, and the Corolla reappears. I'm like, oh, where's your Audi? It's like, oh, it was a lease, right? Why do you do that? I don't want to give too much psychological judgment, but probably he wants to portray, well, I'm living the good life. I can't afford it yet, but let me show you, let me portray a lifestyle that really isn't mine. If you go back to the passage, both of the houses that Jesus talks about, the one built on firm rock, the one built on sand, they probably look alike from distance. You cannot tell until you get to the foundation. Why do I bring this all up? That leasing is sinful? No, because I would be the sinner of all sinners. I lease everything, right? But this is the thing. A lease always ends. A lease always ends. I signed a 2-year lease at my apartment. It's a great place. It's a new build. I'm living the life. But I also know it's a ticking time clock because either the rent will go up and I can't afford it and I have to search for a new place to live. How do we tie this into our faith? Well, look, in the modern Christian ecosystem, and let me be a little bit more specific too, in the Asian American church ecosystem, which, it's a majority of our church, and if you aren't Asian American, I hope this will help you see what life is like. The question is this: as I read Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, as I read Paul warning, in a way, his people, as I read Joseph Solomon speaking about his own experience leaving the faith, I realize there are a lot of landlords that we have in the Asian American church. One could be simply this: it could be the pastors, the elders, your favorite preacher. It could be Pastor Tom, it could be Pastor Sam, it could be Pastor Shim, it could be Vince, whoever it may be. But the leadership, often, for Asian Americans, I see often, they're taking care of the faith stuff. Tom's reading 1,000 books. He'll figure out my answers, right? They're preaching and studying. They're doing the hard work. Let me just lease that off. The problem is this: the lease will always end. Pastors, we have landlords too. I had a great, nice, white grandfather landlord named Tim Keller, right? All of my ministry at a young age, all of how I preached, all of how I thought about ministry, I told myself I was a Reformed Presbyterian. I didn't even know what that meant. I just said that because Tim Keller was. He was my landlord. And this is the thing. All of us do this. There's a tendency to do that because it leaves you more secure. But leases always end. Others of us, it may not be a people, but you might be just leasing out of habit. Like, meaning, let me get very specific. And if I touch a couple nerves, I won't be here next week, so it's all good. I thought a lot about my own faith experience as a Korean American. Grew up in the Bay, came down to Southern California, was at UC Riverside, was part of campus ministry, went to seminary, and my life was just, I realized from start to finish, I was just expected to be Christian. And even during those times, even in college, for you to question that was almost seen as a sign of disobedience. So all these doubts I had just kept kind of pushing under and under and under. And there came to a point, even when I was in seminary, I realized, why am I even doing this? Because I've gone so far down this road of habit that my parents dragged me out to church. And that's not a bad thing, nothing to be ashamed of. But never had a moment to really ask myself, am I owning this? Or just leasing out what my parents left me spiritually? Others of us, you lease out the church and your faith to community. And I want to be very careful here. I'm not saying that community is a bad thing. My closest friends attend, they're in this room. People I talk to almost on I talk to Tom more than my wife during COVID because of podcasts, right? He's a close friend, and I think that's awesome. It's a huge blessing that I have from the church. But in the Asian American church, I often think we stay at church because we're scared to lose a community, but not really lose Jesus. We're scared to lose the deep friendships that we've made. And this, I want to be very careful here. It's this tension that this is a beauty and a blessing of the Asian American church. You go to other churches, they don't eat together outside. They go home and watch Sunday football, basically. It's one of the beautiful distinctions of the Asian American church, but at the same time, I often feel like it can become a danger. Where you're coming more out of my friends are here, so I'm just going to come here. You're renting it out. And let me be very careful. These are all good things. They're not bad things. Quick detour to parents. Do not rent out your children's faith to Tim Lee, to Lena, and to the teachers. They're great. But a sign that you're renting your faith as a parent is when you're saying Sunday education at Grace Hill, they'll figure things out. I just got to raise them. That's a sign that maybe you're renting your faith too. And look, I'm not advocating here to question and criticize every sermon that Tom or Sam or Shim preach, but I'm asking of you this: make a conscious decision to own your faith, to work out your salvation. Why? Because a lease will always end. I've seen that happen. I'm not talking even from experientially, but even personally, there have been moments where I realize I am just renting out as a minister my faith. It's my livelihood. Some days I'm just here working because it's what I do. And it's such a deep danger. And I realize, even as I become a parent too, and I see all this stuff, we do it because, one, it's comfortable, and two, it's secure. If I don't need to worry about my faith, someone else will figure it out for me. but leases always end. And you know when they end? Especially when the floods of life come at you. This is the next thing I want to challenge us with. Floods always reveal your foundations. That's what Jesus is saying. And floods will always reveal the brokenness of this world, the suffering that you go through, will always reveal whether you're renting or owning your faith. I know Tom had this really good series on stage theory and all of that. I don't even remember all the stages, right? But one of the stages is kind of like the wall, dark night of the soul, right? And you have to realize everyone's going to hit it. One thing I realized too, we're so young as the Asian American church that I realized we have not experienced deep suffering that we will soon. Right? And as my congregation is getting a little older, as people have to start thinking about their parents passing away or children being, lost to some sort of crazy disease or whatever it may be, that the floods will come. One thing Jesus makes clear is this, that brokenness in this world comes equally for all. Like, read the passage again. The rivers rose for both houses. Like, the house of Jesus was not protected by the floods. Why? I don't know, but I think there is a reason. A moment of crisis will always reveal the strength of your foundations. A moment of crisis will always reveal whether you rent your faith or you own your faith. In physics class, I don't know if you remember, if you're like me, you probably have to make a toothpick bridge. You know what I'm talking about? Like out of a little wood. They give you all these equations and they say, hey, these are designs that work. And the only way you can test whether that bridge will hold is not how nice it looks. You have to do a stress test. You have to put a scale underneath and put book after book and see which bridge lasts the longest. And one thing I realized is this too. There are some bridges where like aesthetically look amazing. Like that's going to hold for sure. But always, if you're like me, the janky ones, the ones that look like it had no chance, carried the most weight. Moments of crisis will always reveal whether you're owning or renting your faith. Let me put it a different way. You only know what holds you together when you're being pulled apart. You only know what stitches you together when you're being torn apart. The least, if you rent your faith, you can get away with it when life is nice, honestly, when no one's in your life, when you don't have true accountability. But when there's a moment of crisis, maybe of faith, maybe a family member passing, maybe a job environment so toxic, maybe a baby that you both, your spouse and you want so bad, but is not coming for whatever reason. Whatever that may be, when that happens, your lease will end. And this is the thing for many of us, when we face suffering or trials or tribulations, the temptation is, God, get me out of this. Like, woe is me, get me out of this because I do not want to be here. I want to overcome the suffering. Or some of us, we just shut down, like, I can't take this. And let me tell you, both of those options, I think, are biblically fine. It's fine. In spurts and in seasons. One thing I hope to really push, and I'm pushing at my church, and I know Tom and Sam and the leadership here are doing too, is when you suffer, you have to also see it as an invitation to see which name is on the deed of your faith. What are you really building on? Because these moments will always reveal your faith. You know how I know this? As a parent. On 4 days ago, January 1st, New Year's Day, I'm back home in the Bay, and my son and daughter are playing upstairs. And all of a sudden, I just hear Sydney and my younger daughter just wailing and crying, right? My kids cry a lot. I don't really know sometimes fake cry and real cry, but my wife, she knows. She knew this was a real cry. She ran up, right? She ran up. She was like Eugene, babe, come up now. I was like, oh, no. Ran up. And, it was a lot of mess. And what happened, I don't know exactly what happened yet, but Sydney has this small but deep gash on her forehead. And it's deep. And she's like, Eli pushed me. And Eli's like, no, I didn't. And I was like, I believe her. But anyways, as that's happening, right? I freak out and she freaks out. And if you know this, especially as a kid, when your parents are freaking out, there's this deep terror, especially when you're a kid, because you never see that, right? And my daughter sees me and Sylvia kind of with a level of distress that she's never seen, and she starts losing it. She gets hysterical, breaking down, crying. We're trying to figure out what hospital to go to. Sylvia's messaging the ER doctor at our church and trying to figure out, should we go to the hospital or not? And I'm just sitting there holding her hand. And I remember she said something so profound where, Sydney, my daughter, if you know her, she's like a social butterfly, but she never talks about Jesus or God, And as a PK, I'm like, hey, you gotta do it sometime soon, right? I hope you're not apostate. But at that moment, I remember she turned to me. She's terrified, kind of like her voice is shaking. She turns to me, she's like, Appa, can I pray? Because I'm so scared. And I was like, wow, it's like, her faith did not come out till she was tested. My son, on the other hand, is the complete opposite. He talks about God all the time, right? Comes to me, he's like, Appa, if God is real, why does evil exist? I was like, bro, you're 6 years old, man. I'll talk to you in 5 years, okay? But he talks a lot, and he has an interest in faith, and he's really attentive in Bible study, and I think that's awesome. But when moments of crisis test him, his faith disappears. When he's sick, I'm like, Eli, should we pray? He's like, no, get me medicine, right? I was like, whoa, right? And hopefully it's not true, but you get what I'm saying. Moments of crisis, you can talk all you want, but your faith will only come out when it's tested. And what I'm proposing here, and what Jesus is proposing here is this: when you suffer, when you're in trials and suffering, that it's floods and rivers over your head, allow them to reveal what is your true foundation. What is your true cornerstone? Whose name is on the deed of your faith? Is it you and Jesus or someone else? Comfort, tradition, whatever it may be. You have to realize this: in the Old Testament, every major character, it was a moment of crisis of faith that allowed them to take their actual first step out of renting their faith for some other reason and actually towards the presence of God. Think about this: Abraham. Abraham is chosen by God out of he has done nothing to qualify himself, but he's chosen by God. You will become the father of my people. And if God came to any of us and said that, you'd be like, I'll probably take it seriously. But Abraham does not. You know when he does shape up? When he is asked to sacrifice his son, Isaac, on the altar, a moment of crisis. King David can talk the talk. I mean, he wrote all the Psalms. He's a great songwriter, right? I wish he was alive now. Christian music would be a lot better. But King David was also a horrible king. You know when his moment of crisis, when he stopped renting his faith, stopped renting being the king of Israel, but actually started taking it more seriously for a moment, was when his affair of Bathsheba became exposed, when Nathan confronted him and sent his own best friend to die out of that. Look at the story of Job. Job is from what seems to be a faithful man, but you don't know until it's tested. In the Old Testament to the New, what you realize is this: the floods will always reveal who is your true cornerstone. We all say we're Christian if you've been raised in the church. We all say that. Tom said something really good in a previous podcast with me. He said, there's a difference between what you know and what you actually believe. What you know is just information. What you believe is that information actually influencing your action. And you don't know until you're tested. I don't want to spend too much time here, but I really want to press this point. When dating people come to me at True North, and even back here, and they're like, we want to get married, the first question I always ask them is tell me your deepest, darkest, ugliest fight. And some of them are like, we never fight. I was like, then you're not ready to get married, brother or sister, because you do not know that person. You are renting that relationship. You are putting up a front. You ask any married couple, married over 10 years, 15 years, what's your relationship built on? It's not like, that trip to Cabo. Right? It's not like, we saved up and we got this nice TV or this house. That's what built our relationship. No, it's like, we went to Cabo and we almost had a divorce. And that's what shaped our relationship. That's when we started renting our relationship and we actually started owning up to it because we saw the reality of what's going on. Allow the floods of your life, the lows of your life, that often we should pray for them to be taken away by God because he has that power. But at the same time to reveal, is Jesus who we say he is in our hearts? Because you can't trust yourself. You don't know. All right, with that being said, how then do we work out our salvation? Let's say you have this moment, you cross the wall, you're like, man, what? I have been renting my faith. Well, how do I own up? I'll end with this. You own your house by building your house, okay? You own your house by building your house. What do I mean? The New Testament, it's full of metaphors of faith and house building being kind of hand in hand. And I love that metaphor and that analogy because there's so much fruit to come out of it. The first thing I want to tell you is this. Let me get very practical and hopefully quicker. A house is not built on blueprints only, but hard labor, okay? A house is not only built on blueprints, but hard labor. You need blueprints. You need information. But if all you have is information, you're never going to build a house. Listen carefully to what Jesus says in the beginning of this passage. Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and acts on them will be like a wise man who built his house on the rock. Verse 26. But everyone who hears these words of mine but doesn't act on them will be like a foolish man. You have to be. This warning is not for everyone. He's talking to people who say, I'm a follower. And what he's saying is this: there is difference between what you know and what you actually do. And if you rent your faith, often the temptation is you only know. There's like a deep, I think a deep addiction ravaging my church, and I think this church too, okay? That addiction, that drug, is called golf, okay? Golf is not a sport. It is a deep addiction. I'm an addict. Not only am I an addict, I'm a dealer of golf. When I've played golf, I don't want to name who they are. I've played golf for like 3 people at this church already this past week, right? And I come down, I'm like, hey, tell your spouse I'm in town and use me as an excuse, okay? Why is golf like this, right? I don't like speaking on it, but I think this is a really good way to illustrate it. If you don't understand why golf is so addicting, let me give you a glimpse of it. Golf, again, not a sport, is an addiction where you look at it and it's the one physical activity when you see the elite people do it, and you're like, those people are more out of shape than me, right? You see LeBron James dunk, you cannot do that. Or if you can do that, let me know. I would love to meet you, right? You see Shohei Ohtani hit a 100-mile-per-hour fastball, none of us can do that. But you see like this average-looking Asian guy that's shorter than you hitting a stationary ball, you're like, I could do that, right? I could do that. Golf is one of those sports out of any other sport where you think you're better than you actually are. Right? I'm a victim of that too. And this is what happens. You know why you do that? Because there is so much theology of golf out there. There is a business built out of theology of golf. There is so much information, lessons, YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, and I know it all. I know it all. I can, maybe second to Shingo here, but I can break down your swing in theory very well because I have dedicated my last 5 years to this mission. But one thing I realize is this: there is a stark difference between what you know in golf and what you can actually do. Golf is one of those sports where the more you know, the more confusing it will get. And unless you practice and abide, as you're about to do, in the actual physical aspect of the swing, all of that is useless. What does that mean for us as a church? Neil Postman writes this prophetically in 1985. The tie between information and action has been severed. Information is now a commodity that can be bought and sold, or used as a form of entertainment, or worn like a garment to enhance one's status. It comes indiscriminately, directed at no one in particular, disconnected from usefulness. We are glutted with information, drowning in information, have no control over it, don't know what to do with it. You know, in 2025, in the Christian ecosystem, he's not a Christian, but this is such an accurate depiction of the church. But go to the courses that Tom mentioned, okay? I'm not saying don't go to those. What I'm saying is this: they're a blueprint. Blueprints are important. You need to start with it. But if that's the only thing you keep going back over and over into, you're not going to build a house. John Mark Comer puts it really well: information alone does not equal transformation. It's necessary, but Jesus' main goal in coming was not to inform you to salvation, but to transform you to a new person. And theology, and it's all important. I'm preaching, it's important. But it's the beginning to own your faith. To own your faith is to truly live and strive out Jesus' words in spirit and in truth. Like, meaning simple things. You know this if you've been in the church. How are your disciplines of faith? And you know, when I say that, if you're Asian American, you get triggered, like morning prayer, memorizing the Bible. I'm talking about other things. Well, how are your disciplines of forgiveness? How are your disciplines of patience? How are your disciplines of grace? Those are disciplines. They're not some things you just hear like, oh, that's good stuff. You got to practice it to own your faith. You know when I know we're leasing our faith and not living in the Spirit? When we're comfortable. When life is chilled out. When we're just like, I'm going to come to church, listen to this sermon. I can skip the first 2 songs, so that's not that important. And I'm good to go. You have to understand a house is not only built on blueprints, but hard labor. And this is the thing. I think the sermon series you guys are going to is a perfect way to start that. Go to all the courses. Listen to Tim Keller. Listen to John Piper. Listen to whoever your preacher of choice is. But learn to abide and practice. And I'll leave it up to Tom and the leadership team to do their job of informing you how to do that. Second, if you owning your house is building your house, it's not just built on blueprints, but hard labor, but a house will always need renovations. A house will always need renovations. I'm staying at my brother's house, and it's an awesome moment because he's my little brother, but he bought his own house. It's great. And I remember he was like really excited to buy that house, and he was like going to show it off to me, and it's a great house. And I'm actually kind of the reason why he got it, but that's a different story for a different time. But as I'm staying there, one thing I realized as he's going through the stress of ownership is a house is never a finished product, right? Like, a house can look great, but something will always go wrong, right? As I'm sitting there, Kevin's like, oh, this is a great house, but we got to fix this, we got to fix that. And I realized a house always needs renovations. We should expect the same for our own faith. Meaning, the minute you become a follower of Christ, it's not like, oh, everything will be great. No, it's, okay, you own your house. Beautiful, great. Work on the renovations. What does that mean? Some things like this. Are there certain doubts that you've always had about God or about faith? Maybe you had a family member pass away out of no reason other than disease, and you're like, how could God allow that? Maybe you're confused on like, look, I look into the world, I'm a little more left-leaning politically, and it just seems like, oh, the church and my politics, they don't mesh. And, but I don't want to think about that. Or like, man, I got kids. I'm worried how they're going to be raised, but I don't want to think about that. If you own your faith and don't lease it out and rent it, you have to face your doubts. You have to start fixing the small cracks that appear, because that's what owning a house is. Another thing, do you fight the quiet sins in your life? The quiet ones. If you rent a house and it's on fire, like if you own it or rent it, you got to put it out or you're going to die. So for many of us, when we think about sins, we're like, oh, spectacular sins. Like, oh, like don't kill someone, okay? Don't like gossip to a point where their friendship is dead. Don't do these extravagant ones and we're fine. But just like in the house, like if a major things happen at my house that I'm renting, I'll fix it because it affects me. But the small cracks, the small things that I see, there's a crack right now in my garage, like wall. I'm just like, whatever. Not my problem. It will become a problem sooner or later. What are the quiet sins that only you know about? That no one else has the ability to know but you? The deeper addictions, maybe golf, but whatever it may be. Maybe porn, maybe sexual sins, maybe anger, maybe rage. What are those quiet sins that if you're renting, you're like, whatever, not my house. But if you own it, you're like, man, the ones that only I know about, I got to fix. I got to repair them. Are there people here in this congregation where for whatever reason, there's a break in a relationship and you actively avoid them? Same thing. Why are they here? Well, they're probably here to test and to allow you to own your faith. And look, renovations are always a communal project. It's not just an individually, which it might seem like with the sermon, but it's a communal effort. You got to hire plumbers if it gets too bad. You got to hire an electrician if your wiring is all out of whack. Use the community around you. A house is never really a finished product. Lastly, and the most important point I think is this, and I'll end with this, a house always needs capital to be built. As I say all this, you're probably like, if you grew up in the church, you're like, this sounds legalistic. Eugene sounds like a Pharisee, right? But if you know me, you know I'm not, okay? But you're like, this sounds anti-gospel, anti-grace. Let me tell you one thing. Paul says very clear in Philippians 2, hey, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling, but he ends it by saying, for it is God who is working in you both to will and to work according to his good purpose. Paul's the same guy where he says, hey, work out your own salvation when I'm gone in fear and trembling. Also the same guy that says you are saved by grace and grace alone. What gives? You know that weight you feel right now where you're like, man, that's a lot of stuff to do. Good. Because building a house, owning a house is expensive. Look, there's this thing I want to show. I'm in the Bay Area, and housing is crazy, okay? This was on Zillow a year ago, and it made, like, news crazy, okay? You look at that house, you're like, oh, that looks beat down. That must not go for anything. Not only that, if you look at the fence, there's a warning that says, do not enter, because that's an inactive meth lab that San Jose, the city, captured, wanted profit, so put up for sale, okay? You see that, I saw that, I was like, maybe I could buy it, you know? Because who wants to live there, right? And I was like, okay, what's the price? I checked the price, and it was going for $1.5 million. It says inactive meth, they didn't even clean up the meth lab. That's how expensive it is to own a house in the Bay Area. You need a lot of capital. You need to take out a loan to own a meth lab. That's crazy, right? You need money to own a house. You need money to build your faith. You need money to stop leasing and to own it. And you hear this, you're probably like, that doesn't sound like the gospel. Let me end with this. God paid for all that capital that you need to own your faith, to build your house. He paid the down payment. He covered the mortgage. He took care of all of that. Look, if God was a real estate developer, he's the worst real estate developer of all time. Because look at our lives. He's handing out mortgages left and right as Jesus died on the cross for our sinful selves to give us new life. You know what he's saying? I am paying for that capital. When I tell you to build your house, to work out your salvation in fear and trembling, all the money and the capital is paid for. When you look to the cross, what Jesus is saying is this: don't just rent, you got to own it. It's a lot of work, but I paid for it. Don't worry about the cost. You're not in danger of losing the house into bankruptcy or to dissolvency. You're good. Look, landlords suck, okay? I don't know if I can say this because it's recorded, but my landlord right now, he's average, okay? Like, landlords, they don't care about you. They care about profit. They care about how can I get tenants that will make me money. And when you come to landlords with, this is happening, you're like, good luck. Figure it out because you're renting. Jesus is not a landlord. Jesus is telling you, no, I'm giving you an inheritance. I'm passing down to you. No taxes. You don't got to pay nothing on it. I'm giving you a new opportunity to build your faith on me. Don't rent it. You're wasting what I'm giving you. So I'll end with this, almost at True North, Grace Hill, an invitation to look into your life. Do you own your faith? Do you really own it? Look, 5 years ago, this sermon would have been different. Or like 10 years, I would have been like, you got to own your faith. You're going to hell. You're going to hell. And I'll tell you this, I don't know that distinction. I can't tell, oh, hey, like Bob, like, yeah, you're on that line where you're renting too much, so you're going to go. I don't know. But I will tell you this. I'm not telling this out of, oh, you got to fear that you're going to go to hell. The fear of missing out on what life with Jesus is really like. If you think the Christian life is good friends, good service, and feeling good about yourself, I mean, they're there, but that's just the cusp of it. Jesus is so much more than just the tertiary and secondary things that church gives us, which are all important, but his presence alone, when you own your faith, is so much more enjoyable and life-giving than anything you can ever imagine. So the invitation and the question I ask for you is this: are you leasing your faith or owning it with a down payment paid on the cross for you? Let's pray. Father, I hope